For our next panel, China, a peek over the wall. Please welcome to the stage Tom Whayne, Namrata Goswami, Blaine Curcio, and Louis Hong.
Good to go? All right, well, I'm going to get started. All right, welcome, our panel on the China space industry. And we've got three expert panelists, and I'll do quick introductions, and then we'll dive right in. We've got a lot of material that we want to share with you. So first to my left is Namrata Goswami. She's an accomplished author and professor, currently teaches at the Thunderbird School of Management at Arizona State University, and she has co-authored a book called Scramble for the Skies, The Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space, which I highly recommend that you all purchase leaving today. And then she also will be has a book that's coming out next year on space policy. So very, very pleased to have Namrata here with us. Blaine Curcio to Namrata's left is a consultant who has his own company, Orbital Gateway Consulting, also works for Nova Space, which is a successor to Euroconsult. And he's really considered kind of the leading analyst on the Chinese space industry with really deep knowledge of the commercial sector in China's space industry as well as other areas, as you will find out. He does frequently comments and does analysis on the Chinese space industry. And he's the editor-in-chief of China Space Monitor, which is a monthly newsletter that deals with a number of very interesting topics, which I also highly recommend that you subscribe to. And then to Blaine's left is Louis Hong, who is both an operator and now an investor. He's the co-founder and general partner at FP Solutions, which is a venture capital firm focused on space tech, on green technology, as well as robotics and automation. He was a former very senior SpaceX executive for more than a decade, and he ran manufacturing and supply chain there for 4 or 5 years at SpaceX, and has very broad-based management and entrepreneurial experience, both building the world's first rocket factory to the highest density battery pack, as well as a fast casual restaurant. So very broad-based restaurant. So very broad-based experience, and so we're really happy to have all three of our panelists with us. All right, so diving in, the first topic we want to get into is really the recent transformation of the global space industry and China's and SpaceX's key role in that. And there's one macro observation that we'll get into in pieces, but the first thing is, when you look at the US and China together, it accounts for 80% of total orbital launches in 2023. And then also importantly, from a financing standpoint, over the last decade, 75% of total funding in the space industry comes from China and the space industry. So let's deal first with launch. Chad and the team put together a really interesting time lapse of orbital launch activity going all the way back to 2006. And you can see it does by country: Russia, China, other US, rest of the world, Europe, India, and then importantly SpaceX, which comes on the scene later. And what's interesting when you look at this, I'll show the time lapse. So start at the beginning. You got clearly Russia is the largest player in 2006, remains that way in 2016, and then there's a crossover. China becomes the largest launch provider in 2016, and then gets surpassed by SpaceX by itself in 2022. Now this gives a perspective to the modern day. We also take a view as to what is announced ambitions for launch activity in the year 2024. SpaceX is projecting to do about 150 launches. They did 96 last year, or 98. China, which did around 62 last year, is projected to do 100. And so, both those companies are a factor of a multiple, 5 to 7 times what Russia's doing, which is the same thing that they were doing, the third provider, back 6 years ago or even 10 years ago. So massive transformation in the industry. China and SpaceX really have been on the forefront of that. And so, which leads into the first question on orbital launch, and I'll pose it to you, Louis. Given your front row seat in SpaceX's rocket development. Would really like to have you comment on the growth of both SpaceX as well as China's activity in recent years, and also if you could get a little bit into the relative cost advantage that you see today that SpaceX has relative to the Chinese launch providers.
For sure. Yeah, thank you, Tom. If you look at this chart, SpaceX has definitely come a long way. I still remember kind of back in the days when I first joined, back in 2012, we were just pushing kind of the first F9 V1s, kind of out the door. And back then, in 2012, Elon's already telling everybody, okay, I want everything to be designed to be minimum of 40 launches a year. In a year, when the entire world's launch capacity was, I think cadence was at 70 around that year, if I remember. Everybody thought, man, this guy's crazy, okay? We're barely getting the first launch up successfully, and you're already talking about, a ridiculous amount of number. Who needs all these launches? It's kind of like in the back of our head. And then furthermore, Elon added one more line, and these rockets will all need to be reused. And then now, by this point, everybody thought, okay, yeah, this guy needs to go back to Mars or something. Just completely out there back in 2012. But that was the vision that Elon already had way back in the day. And now fast forward, obviously, SpaceX has done tremendously over the past decade. As Tom mentioned, did almost 100, last year's, pushing for 150 this year. And, just from the beer chat, last week, it sounds like they have, another 20, 30% on top of that, for the coming year as well. And they can keep going, but now they're kind of self-throttling because, other strategic kind of directions. So you can imagine kind of SpaceX created this tremendous capacity, for launches. Now they were able, I think what most people don't realize is that SpaceX accomplished this, with only a fleet of less than 20 boosters. Okay, and that goes to show you kind of the power kind of a reuse. Okay, when you're building a brand new rocket, it costs about $50, $60 million close to cost, but the marginal cost for reusing a rocket, we're talking about, a range of 15 to 20 mil, and that's still on the high side. There's still plenty of room for SpaceX to go down, and achieve that. So you're talking about, a rocket with an ROI of, 1.5 launches, more or less, and then you're back. And that's what SpaceX is competing in. So it's both combination of reuse and the rocket, kind of the reuse, the booster fleet. I think SpaceX created tremendous capacity, for the entire industries and disrupt the entire industry. Now, because SpaceX couldn't sell to China, a lot of Chinese, competitors couldn't use SpaceX launches. I think that's created a whole new market, kind of for things over in China. And as you can see, they're tremendous. People look at this number, and then China did 100 launches, or targeting 100 launches without reuse. So you can imagine kind of their production capacity and the power of their value chains. If once they cracked out kind of reuse, which is it's gonna come up at some point. But still at this point, based on our discussions kind of with industry, kind of experts, I think China's launch cost, per unit, it's still stuck kind of back in the kind of $15,000 per kilogram kind of range, kind of on average. So it's still back kind of where in 2012 kind of SpaceX kind of worlds, kind of just for perspectives.
Fascinating. Thanks, Louis. So shifting gears to finance. As I mentioned before, 75% of the last decade, 75% of total funding into the space industry has come from either the U.S. or China. And question for you, Blaine, could you comment on the growth in China venture funding for the space economy in recent years? And in particular, if you could characterize the sources of funding from government, federal, provincial, as well as venture funding as part of that funding stream.
Sure. So I'll try to keep it pretty short, but cover a lot of ground here. So the first point I would mention is, if we look at the chart, we see that as recently as 2015, the amount of funding going into Chinese commercial space companies was basically zero. And over that last 10 years, we've seen, I think, a couple of stages. So there was this initial stage where everybody was just in shock that there was even this commercial space concept to begin with. It's an industry that's always been government controlled, and what does it mean that you can have a private company launch rockets and raise money from Sequoia Capital China, for example, that was just unheard of. And so for this 2015 to say 2020, really the industry was in a hockey stick growth mode in terms of growth from a zero, starting point of zero, let's say. And I would say that we saw over that period maybe 100 companies get founded, a lot of capital coming into the industry from a lot of different sources, as you alluded to, private VC, but also provincial and city governments. The last handful of years, I think we've seen a bit of a shift where investors are a little bit more cautious, and they want to see a little bit more of, what's your actual business plan, what's your real revenue projection, as opposed to just you're a bunch of rocket scientists with an idea and a PowerPoint. I think this has probably been at least partly driven by, frankly, like pretty high valuations. If you look at the valuations of some of these companies at some of these funding rounds, you're looking at multiple billion US dollar valuations for companies that have, minuscule revenues and even, tenuous paths to revenue. And I think in that kind of an environment, especially when looking at like all the other risks that Chinese VCs are looking at, if you're then throwing on top of that a very high valuation, the only investors that are really going to be getting on board are provincial or city governments where there's a industrial development angle or kind of we're being consistent with some national level policy angle. You're not going to necessarily get private investors who are willing to accept the technology risk and the regulatory risk and all the other risks, and also a very high valuation, which is, I think, what we've seen. Most of these companies that are, let's say, the champions that are actually going towards revenue, their valuations are getting to be quite high.
Okay, thanks, Blaine. And we'll get into later about one of the two major mega constellations that's on the drawing board is really being funded largely by provincial government, as well as some VC funding around the edges. Namrata, a question for you. As far as China's investment climate and the priorities of the government, what are they looking for near term, medium term, long term in terms of big priorities?
Yeah, sure. So continuing with what my fellow panelists have said, the one thing that when I think about China's near-term, mid-term, and long-term investment plans, what is interesting is that under President Xi Jinping, it is really vital to realize that when you think about a Chinese commercial space company, it's not similar to SpaceX or Blue Origin. It is a state-pushed, state-held, as well as state-monitored commercial space company. So that's the first thing. So within that, what is interesting is that China has come up with several very critical policies. One is, of course, their innovation policy, which they want to achieve very high and, for example, low Earth constellations within the year 2025 to 2030 and be a competitor to SpaceX. The second important thing is that this is also connected to emerging as a technology leader by 2045. So within that, what they're looking at is launch capability. So one is, of course, building constellations. Second is to be able to build launch, which is not just Long March 5, but systems like Long March 9, which is going to be reusable by 2030, which is very similar to Starship in terms of its configuration. And then in the long term, what is very vital from the policy perspective is that you connect your innovation policy to your medium-term goal of emerging as a technology leader, and then finally by 2049 to emerge as the most critical economic space power, which will then draw in investments and very vital collaboration across the world. So that's what I see in terms of Chinese policies.
Thanks, Namrata, which is a nice segue into, this is a framework that Space Capital has used for the economy and investments in launch, satellites, Earth observation, SATCOM, GPS, as well as other emerging areas of the space economy. And so we find this a useful framework. And for China, we've sort of broken it up into the key players that are state-owned enterprises at the top, and then some of the leading commercial players at the bottom. And I was wondering, Blaine, if you could walk us through briefly some of the key players. Obviously, we have a lot of logos on here, but just some of the key SOEs, some of the key commercial players that the audience should sort of keep in mind going forward.
Sure. So I guess just one thing that stands out on this graphic is it illustrates the difficulty in really even categorizing SOE versus commercial. There's a couple of companies in the SOE box on launch, for example, like Cast Space, the one in the sort of middle bottom part, where they're nominally commercial. Their let's say their reason to exist is in some sense to make money, but at the same time they have a lot of support from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, a lot of support from provincial and city governments, and to Namrata's earlier point, there's probably a certain level of just general government involvement in that company, or at least surveillance, for lack of a better word. So, digressing, and with that point aside, I think certainly there's several major state-owned enterprises that are worth looking at. So, on the top of that launch column, you have CASC and CASIC, so CASC and then CASIC, respectively, the leading, let's say, state-owned space contractor, and then CASIC is more the leading state-owned missile and other kind of defense contractor, but also with one foot in space, arguably. So those are certainly the two biggest ones. I mean, they're each 180,000 employees, 40-ish billion US dollars per year in revenue per company. CASC is the main contractor for things like, or CASC or their subsidiaries are the main contractors for things like the Long March rockets, Chinese space station, et cetera. And then, as you mentioned, you have all of these different commercial companies that have emerged, and to pick a few of these logos, I mean, X-Space, which is down in the commercial launch box, apart from having a very interesting name where I can probably guess where they got the inspiration from, they were the first commercial launch company, but they have a lot of backing from CASIC, the SOE that I just mentioned. I mean, really, so one of the takeaways that you could say is a lot of these companies are intricately linked to one another because you have a lot of commercial companies that have support from the state in some way, or indeed are direct spin-offs from some of these state-owned enterprises. Maybe one or two more that I would point out. I mean, Mino Space and Yuanshin Satellite, which I think I see, the two leading commercial satellite manufacturers, arguably, and they both have kind of piggybacked on some of these large government programs. They seem more likely to get a level of government support in terms of actual buying their services. A lot of government support in China is it's more indirect. It's like the provincial government will give you some free land for your factory, or they will give you some subsidies if you hire master's degree students that are in this city. But in terms of actual government giving a commercial company money for a space-related service, comparatively rare, but some of these that I just mentioned, we're starting to see that happen a little bit more often. So a tangled web of commercial and SOEs with a lot of relations between the companies, but not sure if there's any other ones that really stand out from here.
Thanks, Blaine. So Namrata, the Secretary of the Air Force recently made a comment or an observation that you could argue that China has superiority in certain space industry capabilities. I don't think it's launch, but on this page, where would you argue that China actually has a strategic advantage today?
I think when I hear about the Secretary of Air Force, I think what he means is that when you think about tactical, multiple, diversified launch, China is ahead. So, and that's very clear. They have the Long March 8, which can launch from a sea platform, the Long March 5, Long March 2. So what they're working, and also their private commercial space entities are developing diversified launch platform. I think what he means is that, and this is where I think it's really vital when you think about China's space program and the US space program, while you might have very amazing technologies like, for example, Starship, what is important is that in the Chinese ecosystem, especially their investment in commercial, civil, military, it is guided by a very clear ambition of where they want to go. One is with the restructuring of the current PLA Strategic Support Force, which is their version of the Space Force. They changed it just last week and announced on April 19th that they would actually create a separate space force called the Aerospace Force, and their focus is on enabling access, control, and by that they mean an ability to be launching when they want. So I think that's where the Secretary is pointing to, that if you destroy a satellite and you're not able to launch immediately to replace it, China has that capability today. And so that's where, and that's vital in terms of responding, for example, to any conflict scenario.
Okay. Thanks, Namrata. All right, so shifting on just to this sort of gives us a recent history of some of the key milestones in the development of Chinese space industry. And again, color-coded, green events involving the government, orangish being, or tan being, commercial. And Namrata, if you could, walk us through some of the key industry milestones involving both the SOEs as well as the commercial players since 1970.
So some of the key government milestones that I would think are extremely vital are one, that around 2002, and which should be, that's why I was looking at the chart, I'm sorry. In 2002, China took a decision that they are going to be investing in lunar capability and become a permanent presence in cislunar space by 2036. So that's extremely vital. And then what is another important vital government intervention is this willingness to be able to invest in long-term space missions like space-based solar power, for example, reusable launch, and then the important idea that the Earth-Moon system, which we heard in the earlier panel, is a commercial entity. So this is where I think it's vital. So, and that's why I say that when you think about some of the milestones, policy is one, capability is second, and third, I think this is again extremely vital. Since 2014, China has taken two decisions. One is that it's going to enable their commercial space industry, and they actually put out a document called Document 60, where they pointed out that one of the vital weaknesses of China is the inability to utilize their own innovative structure for what, for example, companies like SpaceX might do. And so, document, policy, and then the other important milestone that I see in terms of the Chinese space program is this ability to change the narrative around space, and which the government pushed a lot, which is that space is not just about Apollo-type missions where you send humans for a few days and bring them back, but actually space is about economic development. Space is that when you invest in, for example, satellite internet, presence in cislunar space, it's about what you can actually profit from. So they're very clear. And then finally, and this is something where I think the US is behind in terms of milestone, is that in 2020, the China National Development and Reform Commission declared space assets a critical infrastructure, which the US hasn't done yet. And by that, what they mean is that, first of all, space assets and infrastructure, which includes ground to low Earth orbit to cislunar space, will get priority in terms of funding and focus. And second, if they are targeted, that's absolutely something that China would not accept because that affects China's ability to function as a modern state. So those are very critical milestones in my mind.
Yeah, thanks, Namrata. So I'll go, so first first Louis and then Blaine. I'd be really interested in both your views of the importance of the commercial sector, some magnitude of the commercial sector to China's space ambitions. I know, Louis, you recently traveled to the region and got some perspectives on that, so I'd love to hear from you on that.
Sure, of course. Actually, I was just talking to Blaine about this kind of in the backstage. Like from our conversations, kind of I think with different players, both from the industries and investors and entrepreneurs. I think the common perspective is that China has a ton of resources kind of going into space, and as Namrata pointed out, this is very critical kind of nationally. But there's not a whole lot of coordinated effort, as kind of we've seen kind of here in the U.S. With NASA kind of dominating kind of the overall directions, and a lot of industry players kind of obviously building along that ecosystems, So and then I think for a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises, the speed and the risk-taking is very, very much lacking. I think just with the inherent kind of nature of the organizations. So with commercial players coming in, I think that will greatly improve kind of the speed and executions kind of in getting some of these goals that that have listed. So
thanks, Louis. Blaine?
Sure. So definitely, I think there'd be two main impacts. So to Louis's point, the commercial companies are certainly able to develop certain specific technologies, maybe not more quickly in all situations, but they've been developing technologies that the state-owned enterprises want, but that maybe their innovation structures are not optimally set up for, to Namrata's point. And so you have commercial companies that are developing things like, liquid-fueled rocket engines or laser inter-satellite communication terminals, where there are certainly teams developing these same technologies inside the SOEs. They're probably pretty well-funded teams. They're probably pretty good at what they do, but the innovation structure within those SOEs is just not necessarily optimally set up to develop some of these types of technologies. So I think the first part is a lot of these commercial companies are actually having a meaningful impact on let's say, China's overall technological capabilities. And then the other point is, I think they have forced the SOEs to move a little bit more quickly in the way that they do things, or at a minimum, the SOEs have started to take commercial players more seriously. And I think that when you look at, let's say, keynote speeches by SOEs at Chinese space conferences back in, say, 2018, 2019, I mean, if they ever mentioned commercial companies, it was in a kind of snide, like not particularly serious way. It was like, oh, 2018, these commercial companies, they're just, they exist and we don't really pay attention to them. And I recall a couple of years ago at the China Space Day conference, it's a big kind of flagship conference. They had somebody from CALT, I think, the launch subsidiary of CASC, giving a keynote speech, and they were talking about how, G-Space, the Geely Constellation, how they're an important customer, and how there's other commercial players that are, important customers of the state. And so it's just this real change in SOEs actually taking the commercial players more seriously as a customer, potentially as a technological competitor. Again, I think maybe they've spurred the SOEs to move a little bit more quickly. But yeah, I think that's been a marked change, and I think it's forced the SOEs to think a little bit differently about their place in the world, in some sense.
Okay, thanks. So now I want to shift to the Chinese mega constellations. Clearly, China has significant ambitions for SATCOM and other constellations, and over time they will emerge as significant competitors to both Starlink as well as Amazon's Project Kuiper. The question is, which of these projects will, on the drawing board today, will actually get off the ground, and over what time frame? And what we've done on this page is sort of capture some of the key metrics around Guowang, which is known as Chinese Starlink. G60 Starlink, which is referenced before with Blaine, is more backed by the provincial government in Shanghai and a number of commercial entities, venture capital. G-Space related to Geely, which is a big auto manufacturer, and then obviously in Huawei, which we'll come back to. I guess I would ask first, Louis, if you could just give an overview of the various mega constellations and the likely timing for deployment in your eye.
Oof. The later question is the tough one. I try to obviously fish for that as well during my trip. I think obviously Guowang, or as they call it, Xinwang, which is almost like a direct translation of Starlink. Kind of that's the dominant, I would say, systems right now. Kind of in with the most resources, the most speed. Obviously, I think it's the sort of as the name suggests, right, the national kind of systems. So that's. But at the same time, as I mentioned, this is something from within the systems, and then they move. There's a lot of, they compared it to almost like the space shuttle programs, where there's a ton of, like parties and considerations that are not necessarily associated with kind of with the satellite themselves, that they need to be considered kind of as part of these organizations. So the speed and the progress that it's made, I think it's not as great, as many people perhaps had hope, and seen coming with the organization with this much resources. Now G60, on the other hand, is a provincial kind of coming out from Shanghai satellite kind of group, and they came from the industries, so I think have a deeper kind of roots kind of in the satellite from the get-go. Now, but relative to kind of, again, national resources wise, I think it's not comparable, I think, to Xinwang, and I think their strategy is, okay, well, besides China, let's look, kind of to the rest of the world, kind of as an opportunity kind of for expansion rather than going directly head to head, kind of back home with Xinwang. G-Space, I think it's, from the sound of it, it sounds like they want to focus specifically kind of on the GPS area, like specifically the new low Earth orbit kind of GPS constellations. And Huawei, I don't think they made any official announcement yet on their strategies, but they're very likely, they will probably work with, one of the big ecosystem being, China's #1, Apple, so to speak.
Yep. And I'm going to come back to Huawei and the next section of the conversation with Blaine. But Blaine, quick question for you. These are obviously global constellations, and real question of where they're going to market their services outside of China. What are the realistic target markets that, that Guowang and G60 Starlink and others will be targeting going forward?
Sure. So I think with Guowang, there's definitely some low-hanging fruit with any Chinese state-owned enterprise that has an international presence. You could imagine in an ideal world there could be some level of synergy there, where if you're a Chinese oil and gas operation that's run by the state off the west, coast of West Africa, let's say, a state-owned constellation would seem like, again, pretty synergistic in that context. And really with Guowang, I mean, when you look at the people that are running China Satellite Networks Limited, the way that they've communicated themselves, I think state-owned enterprise demand and government demand is probably the biggest thing that they're going for at this point. Maybe some government-to-government stuff in Belt and Road countries, but in general, they seem like a very closed, not particularly commercially minded entity, if I may be so presumptuous. G60 Starlink seems a little bit more commercially minded. If you look at their team, like they have a couple of long-time Orange people working for them. They have some telco people. They're moving faster, as Louis alluded to. One thing I've heard from this type of company is that as a condition of the Chinese government opening up the industry to players beyond Guowang, they're requiring some of these commercial players to access markets outside of China first and to not access the domestic market first, because I guess implicitly you have Guowang, which has this state sanction, it's state approval, let's say. Then you have the big three state-owned telcos. I mean, it's a state-run industry within China, and so to have a commercial constellation coming in and ruining that can't be allowed. The other two, G-Space and Huawei, I mean, you could certainly imagine some synergies with their existing businesses. G-Space, I mean, they have their vehicles. They also own, I think, Proton, the Malaysian car maker, Lotus. Yep. They have a Volvo. Yeah. So you could imagine that. With Huawei, I mean, I think it's a really interesting thought exercise of, they're one of the only companies, if not the only company, that builds both, mobile phones, so the direct-to-device angle, but also the networks angle. So all the Huawei 4G and 5G towers that are being installed across Belt and Road countries, you could imagine a scenario where there's some high degree of integration, like line fitting, of just every Huawei 5G tower has a Guowang or a G60 Starlink or a Huawei Constellation receiver on the tower, and if you have to use it, you can use it, and if you don't, you just use terrestrial. But yeah, certainly you could imagine with those other two, G-Space, Huawei, a bit more synergy with their existing business, even if it's a little bit further off, probably.
Okay. And Namrata, would like to comment a little about your view of the likely deployment timelines, particularly of Guowang and G60?
Yeah, so I agree with Blake that what China would do, and even if you notice this chart, I see the state and commercial fusion. So first of all, it's driven by policy. So as I said, in 2020, China argued that satellite internet, including low Earth, geosynchronous, cislunar space communication infrastructure, is a critical infrastructure. That's number one, right? Number two is that what is interesting is that China has registered about 13,000 satellites with the International Telecommunication Union to build a large satellite constellation by 2030. And the other interesting thing I noticed with at least their conceptualization is that it is not just low Earth orbit constellation, but they're talking about higher Earth orbit. For example, the G60 Starlink, the first satellite that was launched, they're thinking of placing it about 20,000 kilometers above Earth. So you notice Chinese policymakers and scientists talk a lot about why it's so vital to have satellite constellations, not just in LEO, but also in medium Earth, and then scale it up. Don't forget that China is the only country with a cislunar communication infrastructure in place today, with two relay satellites, the Magpie Bridge 1 and 2. The Magpie Bridge 1 is in Earth-Moon Lagrange Point 2, and the Magpie Bridge 2 that is supporting the Chang'e 6 in real time today is in the lunar elliptical orbit. So, and then finally, what they are trying to push is the interest of commercial constellations of satellites through low Earth orbit to cislunar space by funding and offering subsidized rates and manufacturing capability. And then finally, I'll say that in terms of policy, China included satellite internet and any kind of constellation infrastructure in their 5-year plans. So that's vital. Once it makes it to their 5-year plans, which is 2021 to 2025 and beyond, I would say that they would push very hard to be able to achieve this and becoming a competitor.
Okay, thanks, Namrata. All right, so I want to shift to their China's ambitions to compete with Starship long term. And clearly there's two programs that China has to compete with SpaceX today. One is Long March 10, which is their Falcon Heavy analog, if you will, and then ironically Long March 9 moving backwards, which is their Starship competitor. And so Louis, it'd be great to have your perspective on these respective Long March programs, both 10 and 9, and their likely deployment timeline and potential to compete with SpaceX ultimately from a cost perspective.
Okay, I think the latter is hard to comment because you can never underestimate China and their speed, But just judging from again all the conversations, Long March 9th it's gone through a few pivots. I think it started out as like an SLS equivalent, and then people saw Starships like, oh wait a minute, okay, we need to obviously be obviously beating a new benchmark. So I think he has gone through a few iterations. I think as a result, I think timeline has been pushed back kind of as a result of that as well. I think we're looking at 2030, the best case scenario for pilot flight, or potentially, even beyond that. But Long March 10th, okay, which, it's slated to carry kind of the next astronauts kind of back to the moon, I think has a greater national, strategic importance. And I think it's getting more resources and attentions. And I think it has a more aggressive timeline as a result of that too. I think it's I hate to compare it to kind of another the moon race, but I think there's sort of like the underlining tone that who can kind of get back to the moon and actually stay there, do something meaningful. And I think Long March 10th is a critical element of that, and I think it's getting a lot of attentions and from the top down, kind of pushing for that. So maybe 2027, that's the optimistic kind of scenarios for a pilot launch.
Okay, Namrata, your views?
So again, I agree with you. 2027, 2030 is what they are saying. What I found interesting is that when I was in China interviewing policymakers in terms of the Long March 9, around 2017, they were not very confident in making it into a reusable system. They were still talking about it being expendable. Something changed in 2022 because in December around 2022, they announced that they're going to make the system reusable, which means they got the confidence to do it. And this is something I've observed with their lunar missions as well. The moment the missions go beyond just media to actual white papers and position papers in the UN, they're going to do it. For example, if you look at China's position on lunar resource utilization, for example, what we talked about, water ice, helium-3, rare earth minerals, their position paper at the legal subcommittee of the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs says that Chang'e 6, Chang'e 7, Chang'e 8 are all going to be accomplished before 2030. So what they are looking for, and this is where I think the difference comes, and I always like to make the difference in terms of policy. So when you think about China's rationalization for their Long March 9, why are they building this rocket? It is not for the sake of the rocket. It's for accomplishing first to build large platforms in low Earth orbit like a space-based solar power satellite. The designer of the Long March 9 gives a very clear idea. Second, to accomplish very large missions to the moon, like building a base. And finally, their missions to Mars. So it's a very clear vision as to why they're actually accomplishing this. And if you look at their missions for Mars, Moon, it's all within the range of 2030. So they're hoping that they'll achieve it with the Long March 9.
Okay. So we are nearing the end of our time, but before we end, I'd like for each of the panelists to just give you one prediction that relates to your view of an important development of the China space economy in the next year, and then secondarily over the next decade. Blaine, you want to start?
So over the next year, watch for the start of G60 launches, I think, is going to be one interesting thing. Longer term, in China, there's a acronym that people use, B to B to C, so business to consumer, right? And I think it gets used a lot in the space context. I think consumers in China, the average person, is probably rather more aware and interested in space than we are in the West. And a couple of proof is in the pudding examples from the last few months. We've seen a handful of automakers and mobile phone makers in China coming out with cars or phones that are direct to satellite connectivity. And that's been a big part of their whole marketing spiel. And I've seen a lot of people spreading this on places like WeChat and Weibo, where Geely releases a car and they have in the photo, there's a satellite connectivity with the car, and maybe I'm hanging out with satellite industry people, so maybe it's a biased sample. But in general, I do think, if I compare it to, say, the iPhone Global Star from a couple years ago when the first phone had this emergency SMS, people talked about it, but I don't think it got as much interest. I don't think as many people bought a new phone just because they'd have satellite connectivity. And so I think this B2B2C in China, this China Telecom satellite selling Tiantong service to Geely for their car so that Geely can then resell that service to a consumer. I think that's going to be a big trend in the Chinese space sector moving forward.
Okay. Louis, your predictions?
Well, I agree with Blaine that there will be a lot of commercial activities, I think, in the coming year, in the immediate terms. I think right now, if you look at the economy as a whole, right, unfortunately, it's not doing hot, in many areas. And relatively, space now is the new darling child that everybody is fixated on. So I think there's going to be a ton of resources, both from the state and from private, kind of going into space, looking at the next frontier. And when China sets its mind on something, they will go at it, kind of full, with all their resources. I think let's take an example kind of by what they did to solar. They dropped that industry by 1,000x. Now I think they were finishing up their EV, focus, and I think space is going to be the next thing. So I think there'll be a tremendous amount of resources and a lot of, disruptions coming out from that part of the world. And space is, a common space, and like people said, it is hard, it is hard to do anything in space. And it will be even harder, I think, if we don't all somehow find a way to work together. So I'm optimistic that in the long run, we'll figure, okay, hopefully we'll dial down the ratcheting and then, let's go ahead and push this area together.
Okay. Namrata, finally?
Yeah, so I think next year and a decade from now, next year in 2025, I think we should look out for companies like LinkSpace, LandSpace, and OneSpace because they're invested in reusable vertical launch capabilities, already demonstrating it, and that's going to be an important addition to China's civil, military, commercial fuse program. The second thing is a space-based solar power demonstration they're hoping to achieve with microwave beaming from their Tiangong space station next year. And in a decade ahead, I think we are in for a surprise because China is planning to build a base on the moon by 2036 in collaboration with Russia, and they're doing it for purposes of resource utilization. And so the one thing that I always point out is that when you want to think about the scale and ambition of China's lunar base compared to, say, an Artemis base camp. For example, I'll stop with that. If you think about even developing nuclear power capability, SPD 6 tells you, Space Policy Directive 6 tells you that NASA is directed to develop about 40 kilowatt of nuclear power, whereas Chinese ambition by 2030 is to develop about 1 megawatt, which is so much higher. So that's what I think is going to be a game changer. A permanent structure on the moon is going to challenge your legal outer space treaty stipulations. It's going to change where a particular area like the South Pole has a Chinese presence, which is vital. And so I think that's what we should look out to in a decade from now.
Okay, great. Well, Namrata, Blaine, Louis, thank you for all of your perspective and appreciate your time.
Thank you.